This is Charlie Christensen from the McNally Smith College of Music, Technique 1. This week, we talking about practice.
It's easy to sum it up when you just talk about practice. We sitting here, I'm supposed to be the franchise player, and we're in here talking about practice. I mean, listen, we talking about practice. Not a game. We talking about practice. Not a game. Not the game that I go out there and die for and play every game like it's my last. Not the game. We talking about practice, man. I mean, how silly is that?
How silly is that? Well, to start this conversation, I want you to think a little bit about what the difference is between singing as a hobby and singing as a profession. And people do both, and people spend a lot of time trying to do both well, right? I mean, you think about people that go out and, sing at karaoke bars or whatever, or get up and sing at weddings. And then the difference between that and you and us, those of us that are studying to do this, those that do this professionally. If you think about the parallel between maybe a sport that you like a lot, my favorite sport is basketball. So if I think about the difference between someone who plays basketball as a hobby and the difference and someone who plays basketball professionally, those are incredibly different things. And one of the biggest differences that people who do it professionally actively practice it. So they may be really great already. We had a conversation about whether or not talent is something that you're born with or talent is something that you can learn. But obviously, professional basketball players are already really talented naturally, but they also go out and work really hard. It's their daily work to practice and get better. So it's something to think about, and there's probably a lot of other analogies that work for this. But I want you to think about the fact that you're a professional and how that changes maybe how you're going to go about the work that you do when you're not on stage. Let's first talk about how do you practice. So I have a bunch of questions for us to kind of think about. So when you're practicing, is it regular? Is it structured? Does the moment just guide you? If you feel like practicing, you go ahead and into the practice room. Do you only practice what your teacher tells you to, or do you only practice what you like to do? Do you only practice what you need to do to get through the next day? I know a lot of times when you're in college, you have class tomorrow, and so you have a lesson tomorrow, and that's really dictating what you're practicing on a day-to-day basis, and maybe you don't have a sense of a longer-term thing, a longer-term structure or plan. But think about this, and you should be able to answer that. Next question is, why do you practice? Are you practicing to get a good grade? Are you trying to please your teacher just because you like to sing? Are you so afraid of not knowing the words to that song or not having your homework that you're practicing? Are you practicing to get better? And do you have a plan for that, first of all? Are you practicing to impress your peers? Why are you practicing? The next question is, where do you practice? Are you in a space where you feel really comfortable? Are you in a space where you're inspired? Is the sound in the space appropriate to the song you're singing? For instance, a lot of times when classical singers practice, they try to practice in really big spaces that have natural reverb. Or you're practicing in your car. How much effort are you putting into that place where you're practicing? Are you using a keyboard or CD? Are you practicing a cappella? That can definitely affect what you practice, how well you practice. When are you practicing? So, how many days a week are you practicing? How many hours in those days? Do you practice all at one time or in segments? Do you prefer the morning or the night, somewhere in between? Does it not matter to you? Try to answer these questions. What fits you best, and there's not one universal answer. It's really determined on what kind of person you are. Are you a night person? Are you a morning person? When do you feel like you sing the best? When do you feel like you can sing the longest? Is it after class, or is it before class when you're not tired? The next question is kind of what do you practice? We kind of maybe already talked about this a little bit, but I want to come at it from my point of view, which I really think about every practice session kind of like this pie graph. And maybe there's a couple different kinds of things that I want to practice. And I'm thinking about them all being a different percentage of the things that I'm focused on at that time. And so at first, maybe this practice session might only last 10 minutes, or 5 minutes, or 20 minutes. But I'm thinking that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on breathing. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the songs I'm working on scales. I'm going to work on the song that I'm writing and maybe rehash the chords. I'm going to improvise a little bit, maybe to warm up. So what am I practicing? You can kind of think of it like this bar graph. I mentioned at some point around here that our goal in the voice department should eventually be doing about 60 minutes a day. And so we talked about this too a couple slides ago. Does that mean all 60 minutes in one chunk? Does it mean it's broken up into 2 half-an-hour slots? Does it mean it's broken up into 6 10-minute slots? That's really up to you. Although we all have a different amount of focus. And so for some of us, it may only be 10 minutes at a time. For some of us, we can really hunker down. I had friends, I still do, that can literally practice for 3 hours without hardly stopping, and it seems beneficial to them. But that's not true of everybody, and we shouldn't all hold ourselves to the exact same rules when it comes to this, because we don't do that in our normal life anyways. When you're thinking about practice too, a lot of times there's this confusion between, what's the difference between a warm-up and what's the difference between an exercise? So in my private lessons, sometimes students will come in and they'll say like, well, I was working on the warm-ups that we worked on in lessons. And I have to correct them, no, that the thing that we're working on in lessons is exercising, the exercise. So if you think about, if you're going to go to the gym and work with a personal trainer, you wouldn't spend the whole time with that personal trainer warming up. You'd spend that time exercising. And if you would come to the personal trainer already warmed up, then you wouldn't have to waste your time in that personal training session warming up. You could just work on exercises. Exercises make you stronger and more limber and more agile and quicker and faster, those kinds of things. That's what exercises do. Warm-ups just get you ready to work on those things. So this is why it's really, really important, kind of as an aside, to warm up before you go to private lessons. But it's also something to think about when you're actually practicing, that you should be spending the first couple minutes in your lesson or in your practice session just warming up. And then the rest of the time, when you're working on exercises, you're really working on getting stronger and faster. One thing is like doing jumping jacks. The other one is actually lifting weights or running on the treadmill. That's the difference between warm-ups and exercises. And I hope we can use that lingo or that nomenclature when we're talking about these kinds of things. So maybe you're not practicing that much, and that's not completely uncommon. And there's a lot of excuses for not practicing. Here's a list of them. You don't know how. Maybe you just don't know how the best ways to practice. You don't know what you're supposed to practice. You don't have time. That's the most common one. You forgot, which is kind of part of not having time. I'm not good enough. I mean, maybe you just feel like you're not getting any better in practicing, so you're not going to do it. You're too upset. Maybe something happened. You're just not feeling up to it. You have a cold. Your friends are going out. Maybe there's stuff that you need to practice, but you really don't want to, and so you just don't do it, or you wait till you kind of put it off. You don't, kind of same thing, you don't really want to practice stuff that you feel like you're never going to do. And just like I had to, blah, 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 a lot of excuses. We talked in class the other day about how I had this great professor when I was in undergrad named Rick Biella, and he used to say that it's not a matter of not having time, it's a matter of not making time. So instead of saying, well, I didn't have time to practice blank, if you say, I didn't make time to practice blank, it really puts a different spin on things, and it puts the ball in your court. You're in charge. You're in charge of your time. So if you don't do something, it's because you chose not to do it, I guess is the point. Speaking of kind of fear generally, and I have 2 slides on this, but this quote from Emerson that I like: "The wise man in the storm prays to God, not for safety from danger, but from deliverance from fear." And so I want you to just kind of think about that a little bit. What are you afraid of? Speaking of fear, from the textbook or the book that we're going to use later in this class, there's a quote here. There's a lot in this book, Effortless Mastery, from Kenny Werner, about practicing and getting better and how we do all of that. So I'm excited to get to that at some point. But I wanted to pull a quote here from the book. It says, "You see, fear has ruined your practicing by rushing you through the material, rendering you unable to absorb anything. You try to cover too much ground every time you practice, barely skimming the surface of each item, and then moving on. You ignore the fact that you can barely execute the material because you have no time to notice that. After all, there's so much to practice and so little time. It's frustrating. Even though you're practicing all this stuff, your playing is not improving much. Nothing is mastered. Hearing yourself play the exercise correctly once or twice, you rationalize that you have it. The only problem is, if you come back to it 10 minutes later, you find that you don't have it. You are practicing many things, but nothing is sinking in, and nothing you practice is surfacing when you play. You never stop to think that you should be playing better for all this practice. You have a belief system rooted in fear that you're not supposed to play that well anyway. The results you're getting are confirming that belief." And so I want you to think about this. Does any of this ring true? I know that it does for me from time to time, and actually probably more than I care to admit. This idea that I have so much to practice, and so I just kind of rush through things so that I can check off things off my list. But if I really went back and tried to do the same thing that I feel like I just mastered or I just practiced, I probably wouldn't be all that good at it. And so it's about kind of, I guess what Kenny's talking about here is, it's about kind of shortening our list and really being effective at the things on our list, not just checking them off because we did them. Practicing is not about just doing things. Remember, it's getting better. It's building skills. So let's talk about some other tips here. Think about practicing as though you have an audience, and the whole goal is to actually make beautiful music for that audience. You'd be surprised in how much more focus you can have if you really put yourself in that place. Take breaks if you need them. So if you feel yourself getting tired, don't be a slave to the clock. Take a break. Record your practice and listen back. This is really important. So important to me that I record every lesson that my students take and send it to them, because I think it's so important that we listen to ourselves. But I also record literally every band rehearsal I ever have. Now, it can be difficult to practice or to record every individual practice session you have, but maybe once a week, record and listen back. And I think that listening back to your practice should actually also count as practice. So if you're thinking about, well, I need to practice an hour a day, if you listen back to a half an hour recording session that you did the day before, that's half an hour of practice. So you're halfway done. Set goals for yourself, long and short term, and it really helps to write these down. I think if they're just in your head, it's really easy to become complacent. Be patient with yourself. That's the other kind of thing from Kenny Werner, is making a shorter list. Actively ask, what would your teacher say? And maybe, what would I tell my own student if they just sang what I sang? Don't move on to something if you don't feel like it's up to the standards that your teacher would ask. Now, I use this next slide in my department meeting at the beginning of every school year. And I think we talk about this idea of hard work, and it really is related to practicing very much. And so how do we define hard work? Well, I really think it's being efficient, which you could talk about that as also kind of focus, plus time. So how much are you focusing, and how much time are you doing that focus? And that's how much work you're putting in. Doesn't mean you have to be sweating. Doesn't mean you have to be sore, and actually you shouldn't be sweating or sore. But it's more about mental focus and mental work than it is about physical work for us, because we're not playing basketball, I guess. Now, a lot of people talk about practice logs, and some teachers require them, and I've used them at different times in my life and found them really helpful, and particularly when you have big chunks of time, like over the summer, this is really important for me, just to kind of keep track of how things are going. And there's a lot of different forms of practice logs that you can use. There's a real kind of standard one where you're just kind of listing the date and time and what you practiced. There's this kind of cool circular model where you maybe break down one idea into 4 different chunks, and then you keep track over a long period of time how much time they are practicing that one aspect. So this circle might be just for breathing. And we can talk about this practice log, this form of practice log a little bit later, because it's slightly more outside of out of the box, I guess, because it's a circle. There's kind of a more simple one that you might use where you're just kind of listing different skills. There's kind of the calendar form where you're writing down how much you're practicing in each day of the calendar. There's a kind of really specific one of like how much time you're spending on each skill. There's this form of practice log that you might use with a younger student, where every 5 minutes they practice. This is basically like a game board kind of a thing to try to encourage you. In addition to these kind of paper models, there's also online websites like Ragabox that you can use to track your practice, and obviously you could make your own log on a computer, on a calendar on your computer, those kinds of things. Google Docs. There's also apps on your phone. One that I've kind of seen quite a bit is this Music Journal Pro, which will help you track your practicing. There's a lot of different methods of this, and actually we're going to be doing this in class in the coming week or two. You're going to be keeping a journal of your practice, and we're going to talk a little bit about maybe the best way to do that for you. There's some supplemental material that I'd like everyone to kind of take a look at this week. One is an article in Lifehacker that I've recommended to pretty much every student that I've come across. It's called A Better Way to Practice, and you can find the link to this article in Moodle, but I want to just highlight kind of 2 sections of this article. The first part, this first little area is what do psychologists say? And I'll just read this really quickly. When it comes to understanding expertise and expert performance, psychologist Dr. Erickson is perhaps the world's leading authority. His research is the basis for the 10,000-hour rule, which suggests that it requires at least 10 years and or 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to achieve an expert level of performance in any given domain. And in the case of musicians, more like 15 to 25 years in order to attain an elite international level. You may be familiar with this 10,000-hour rule from the book Outliers. But anyways, that's a lot of time, and the important thing is we just get at it one chunk at a time. Another section that I like of this that I think of a lot is talking about mindless practice. So again, you don't want to just practice the same things that you can already do really well. There's a couple different versions that the author talks about here. The broken record method, where we repeat the same thing over and over without really thinking about it. The autopilot, where we just coast, and the combination of these kinds of things. It's really important that we're not only building muscle memory, but as singers, so much of what happens with our muscle memory, because we can't see it, is emotional or logical. So being a critical thinker, connecting to the emotions of the song, can be really important. And so you can't just turn your brain off, and you can't just think of other things. And that's why it's important to maybe think about smaller chunks for practice, because it's really hard to focus on things. I was talking to Peggy Larson a couple days ago, and she says, it's really hard to focus on anything for more than 15 minutes, which I think I'm getting to the end on this slide show. But I think I've made my point about mindless practice. Please read that article. Another thing I want you to check out is this video by Branford Marsalis. He's a great jazz saxophonist, and he's the brother to Wynton Marsalis, if you know him at all. It's from this video that's on Moodle is from a documentary Before the Music Died, which I also recommend you check out. Okay, so that's practice patterns. I look forward to having a discussion with everyone in class, and happy practicing.